Hi everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm here today to continue my series, Units of Total War, Rise of Mordor. Today I'll be looking at the faction of the Easterlings, a faction that I actually am quite a big fan of, and one that I really wish will be updated quite soon. And you see, that's kind of something I have to bring up about this faction before I go in depth into it. This faction has an extremely small roster, much like Dol Guldur, so as of now, it's not full, which means that in the future I will most likely be making a new version of this video with all the new units that will be added to the mod. So look at this video right now as kind of a snapshot of what the mod looks like, specifically now that it's at version 0.50 or something like that, what with the new update of Rohan. Going back to the overarching series, I look at the units of the mod and look at where they have their inspiration from, both within Tolkien's Legendarium, so pretty much the history of Middle-earth itself, and from real life, for example looking at Middle Age armor. So now that we've knocked that out of the way, let's turn to the actual faction as a whole. Easterlings. The Easterlings, as the name kinda suggests, are a faction that come from the east of Middle-earth. And in fact, I don't know if you can even classify them as technically being part of Middle-earth itself, given that they live further to the east of the map of Middle-earth. Well, some of them do at least. We don't know much about the Easterlings outside of the limited scope of Middle-earth, so we don't know much about them outside in wider Arda, and that is to say the world of Middle-earth, in which Middle-earth itself is part of. The only real depictions that we get of Easterlings further east is in non-canon products such as Shadow of War, Rise of Mordor, a game that I'm quite a big fan of, but one that's most definitely not canon in any sense of the word. Turning aside from the canonicity of the Easterlings, let's just turn to what they represent within Tolkien's world. So the Easterlings are, as I said before, people who reside to the east of Middle-earth and the eastern areas of it, and they are, for the most part, a disorganized peoples, but when roused to war they are incredibly ferocious and incredibly dangerous. Many of them worship Sauron and, by further extent, Morgoth, the original Dark Lord, and many of them are loyal to him, either serving in his armies willingly or being conscripts. Now, that means that within the wider Easterling society, that there are Easterlings who aren't exactly fans or allies of Sauron, and have needed to be subjugated in order to fight for him. That's kind of where the story of the Easterlings starts in a way, and that's kind of due to the influence of the Istari, the great wizards of Middle-earth. So we all know the three main ones in the films, specifically the two main ones that are shown in Lord of the Rings, the films and the books, and those are, of course, Saruman and Gandalf. Both of those wizards respectively being Gandalf the Grey, later the White, and Saruman the White. In addition to them, and shown more prominently in The Hobbit, given I don't believe he appears at all in the Lord of the Rings films, and is only mentioned a bit in the books for both The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, is Radagast the Brown, a wizard whose power is more to do with nature. However, there's more than those three wizards. There's actually two more wizards who are known as the Blue Wizards, and all that we know of them is that they went to the east of Middle-earth. From what Tolkien has said, is that these two wizards, after travelling east, attempted to cause discord, preventing Sauron from fully conquering the area and making a rebellion and a resistance against Sauron's rule, tying him down and wasting his time and resources, preventing him from launching earlier attacks on the free peoples of Middle-earth. Don't ask me for the names of the two blue wizards, because I believe they change according to Tolkien's writings, which, if someone could please confirm that for me in the comments, I would be absolutely grateful. The Easterlings and the Free Peoples of Middle-earth have a very long and contentious relationship. It's one that's all the more exaggerated and made more prominent by the fact that because the Easterlings aren't one cohesive nation like the people of Rohan or the people of Gondor, instead they're many different tribes and confederacies or fighting against their enemies, different tribes over different times will gain supremacy and attempt to attack the west. So the men of Gondor have at different times been attacked by the Wainriders out of the east, the Variags out of the east, I believe, these all being different types of Easterlings, and each time Gondor's strength has been lowered and lowered and lowered, making them more and more susceptible to conquest by the forces of Mordor. In fact, it's due to the Easterlings that Rohan ended up becoming an ally of Gondor, with the ancestors of the Rohirrim destroying an invading Easterling army that was about to defeat Gondor, kind of sealing the alliance between the two kingdoms evermore. So now that we've looked at the history of the Easterlings, we'll look at what they actually do in Lord of the Rings, both the films and the books. In the books, they openly serve Sauron, as far as we know. Unlike the orcs that make up the bulk of his forces, the Easterlings are very much elite warriors, the equal of the Free Men of the West. They're brave, they're determined, and they stand their ground, unlike the orcs who are inherently cowards. The Easterlings fight quite bravely for Sauron's forces at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, helping attack Minas Tirith in both the books and the film, although in the film you don't really see them much, but you can if you just look in the background of some shots. And later on in the books, they fight the army of the West at the Battle of the Black Gate, something in which their role is omitted from in the film. In their performance at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, they're actually killed to the last man, given that they stand their ground and fight even when the battle turns against the forces of Mordor, and they stand their ground so as to keep open a line of retreat for their allies, which goes to show that these men are quite heroic in their own ways, even though they may be serving the powers of darkness. They're very much like the Haradrim in that fashion. So that's what's shown in the core Lord of the Rings books and also the films. In the books' epilogues, we find out quite a lot more about what the Easterlings are doing during the War of the Ring. And that is to say that the Easterlings have been attacking the northern part of Middle-earth, being part of Sauron's great pincer plan, with him attacking southern Middle-earth and the main theatre of the war, that being Gondor, whereas to the north he attacks the Free Kingdoms there with the armies composed mostly of Easterlings, fighting against the dwarves and the Men of Dale. In the giant battle and giant war campaign that comes out of this in the north, the dwarves lose many warriors and the Men of Dale lose warriors, with both kings of both kingdoms dying, including King Dain Ironfoot, the guy who killed Azog in the Hobbit books, and who is shown being portrayed by Billy Connolly in the Hobbit film series, especially in the Battle of the Five Armies. At the conclusion of the War of the Ring in the books, the newly crowned King Aragorn, or King Elisar, as is his actual name I'm pretty sure, he leads wars against the people of the East, so the Easterlings, to try and pacify them, and he ends up being successful in doing so, leading a mixed army of Rohirrim and Gondorian soldiers to enforce the peace for his new kingdom, building ties and alliances with the people of the East. So now that we know the history of the Easterlings within Middle-earth itself, let's look at the Easterlings' inspiration in real life as an overall faction. As far as I'm concerned, the Easterlings don't represent any one group of people, more so the idea of a great horde from the East, which has often been a common trope in literature and history for hundreds upon hundreds of years. If there's any culture that you could kind of try and tie down the Easterlings to, you could possibly see them as being analogues to the Huns, who are attacking a weakening empire. In case of Lord of the Rings, it would be Gondor, but in real life it would be the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. You could somewhat see them as the Mongols too in that fashion, but I wouldn't really say so. They don't quite as well match up to the Mongols. I'd say specifically because in the films, and also in the books too, the Easterlings are portrayed far more as an infantry-based civilization rather than a cavalry civilization. It's kind of hard to make comparisons with the great horse tribes and horse lords and horse hordes out of Eurasia and the steppes, because you can't really make a comparison, except for the Wainriders, who in Lord of the Rings are a group of people out of the East who were a mounted horde, except they fought on chariots, which makes them quite a bit different to real-life hordes that came out of the East, like the Mongols, the Avars, the Huns, etc. So now that we've looked at the historical inspiration for the Easterlings, let's actually take a look at their units now, starting off with their one command unit, the Bane of the Steppes. Wow, that's lagging really damn bad, and I hope it doesn't keep on doing that. So, these are the Bane of the Steppes, and just by the name you can kind of see the connection with horse tribes living out on the open. These guys are very heavy cavalry, And they're very intimidating looking cavalry. I mean, just look at them. Let's break down what arms and armor that these guys bear. Now, just to be clear, you don't see soldiers that look like this in Lord of the Rings at all. And I don't think you actually see any Easterling cavalry in the films at all either. So this is kind of a unit that has been made by the mod for the mod, using inspiration from writing and just history in general, both within Middle-earth and from the historical records. They're all mounted on dark horses, which it's not really a historical thing to mount all your horsemen on one-coloured horses, but for retinues it does make them look a bit more intimidating when the enemy's horses are all colour-coded in one way. The individual Bane of the Steppes, their horses are all armoured. They've got armour covering their faces with spikes. I believe they have segmented plate covering their necks, both the underside and the top side, which will make quite a bit of protection. It'll be difficult to stab this horse in the neck with armour like this, although there are gaps, and the horse's actual main body itself is unarmoured, which means that against pikes they can be killed. So these are heavy cavalry, but they're not quite as heavy as, say, historical cataphracts, whose horses were covered in armour just as much as their riders were. For their weapons, they've got large one-handed axes with a back spike and a spear point. I guess you could kind of say these are like cut down shortened halberds. They definitely look quite nasty. While I don't think there's exactly a historical weapon that looks identical to this, there are many that fit the exact style of weapon that this thing is going for. So I'll give it a plus on historical accuracy for that. The shield is large, round, and blazoned with, it looks like a sun, and it's a big metal shield. Those are definitely historical, although whether or not the shield is completely made out of metal, or if it's wood covered with a veneer of metal, that would be quite a bit more realistic, because complete shields made of metal tended to be quite rare at sizes like this. Small shields like bucklers, totally. Bigger shields like this, not so much. Each man wears a red cloak over and a hood over his head, which just adds to the appearance and can also serve as something to rest on during a campaign march. They've got helmets, but I kinda can't see what type of helmet it is because it's so covered up. They do have armoured breastplates, which again makes them that much more better suited for melee combat. They've got pauldrons and they've got more plate covering their arms, so they're quite well defended in that regard. Their legs are unprotected as far as I can tell. And so are their arms, which is kind of interesting. They've got wrappings covering their arms instead of any armour. That's a bit of a weird choice. Definitely a nasty looking unit for sure. And this is their commanding officer. He's got a big ass sword in one hand. That looks like your stereotypical Middle Eastern scimitar kind of blade that you typically get from fantasy or from the idealized version of history. In real life, I'd say that looks a bit like a cavalryman's saber used for hacking and slashing. Not so much for stabbing, but on horseback you ride down people with that. It'll make quite a mess of them. So yeah, that blade looks very realistic. He has similar armor to the rest of his unit, although he has a helmet which has two prongs sticking out of it, and helmets with prongs and attachments to the helmets are definitely real. You have, for example, the helmets worn by crusaders in the Baltic states, like the Teutonic Order. They definitely had things attached to their helmets, although I'm not too sure about this style, but I'll give it a pass. It looks cool. So yeah, these guys, make them your general, use them as your general, and try and keep them out of combat. But if you send them in with these big weapons, they will be making an absolute mess out of anything that they come into contact with. So now that we're done looking at our general unit, let's look at our melee infantry, the Loca Rim Halberdias. One thing to note, these are the only melee infantry that the faction currently has available to it. But they are heavy melee, and they do the job quite well, so just keep that in mind. If the design of this looks quite familiar to you, that's because you've seen it in the Lord of the Rings films. This is the standard look that they gave the Easterlings in the film, and it is very, very striking. It's absolutely gorgeous, and I think it kind of contributed to my love of the faction, because it just looks so damn amazing. And it also has really nice ties both historically and within the cultures of Middle-earth. And if you're wondering what I mean by that, I mean the red clothing that each of these soldiers wears underneath their armor. And of course, historically, you always wear stuff underneath your armor. You wouldn't go into battle just naked with armor on top of you. These guys wear robes under their armor. They're all red. And while this may seem innocuous out of nowhere, it actually makes a nice tie between them and the units of Mordor. For if you are to look at the more elite units filtered by Mordor, both within the films and their representations within the mod, they also wear red underneath their armor. So I find that a nice link that kind of ties the two factions together when it comes to their elite units. Looking at their armor itself now, each man is quite well armored. I don't know the right way to describe these, but they've got breastplates that are scale, kind of. They've got scaled armor on their arms that's quite large in regards to the size of the scales, and the same thing going for their center of their torso, just where their stomach would be, with the larger breastplate kind of on top of where their chest is. This armor isn't really historical whatsoever, especially when it comes to having massive scales like that. But if anyone could find an example in real life where there's armor like this, I'd be very interested in seeing it. It all looks, well, goldish or bronze, and that could be either because the armor is just steel that's been gilded to make it look that color, or they could just be using bronze armor, which if so, that's a nice way of distinguishing them from the other factions in Middle-earth. They've got helmets that are very much protecting, and while they've got these weird spikes and horns sticking out of them that jut out, which I don't think ever really existed in real life, the actual helmets themselves, the top part of it reminds me of a kettle helmet, which you see used by soldiers in the 100 Years' War, the more lower class troops, as well as in World War I, when metal helmets began to be re-equipped to soldiers after their head wounds began to rise dramatically with the advent of new weaponry. It looks like a mix of that kind of old helmet with the Greek Phrygian helmet, specifically with this part around the face. Because if you look at a lot of those helmets, they're also bronze too, but they'll leave out the eyes and they'll cover the lower half of the face, and there's some examples of them where it looks like the lower face is a beard instead, and they actually look really quite nice. And that's the vibe that I get from this helmet, a cross between a World War I / 100 Years War kettle helmet and a Phrygian helmet with a big faceplate. In terms of what equipment they're carrying, each of them carries a large square shield with cutouts on the top and the bottom. Now, square shields were definitely a thing. The shields are bronze, which also is historical. There were many shields in history that were bronze covered, so these shields are probably wood underneath. They've got big metal bosses in the center, which also was done as a way of strengthening shields. In this exact shape with cutouts in the top and the bottom, that doesn't seem like a historical design that I know of, but the rough shape of a square reminds me quite a bit of the Roman scutum shields. And I guess that's kind of a way you can look at these troops. They're kind of like the Dark Legionaries that are supplied to Mordor by its allies. And then it comes to their weapons. And the weapons that these guys have are pretty damn cool, and they're quite separate from the other weapons in the mod. They've all got maces. And maces are definitely a historical weapon. They've been used around for a very long time, all the way in antiquity to World War I and World War II, where you had soldiers using trench clubs to smash each other's brains out. These look more like medieval maces / antiquity maces, and yeah, I can't say that they look really wrong. They're a bit decorated, but there are many maces in history that are decorated. The weapons are designed more for anti-armor use than anything else, and given that these troops will be fighting against the men of Gondor and also the men of Dale, it's actually a really good choice for a weapon. Although I don't know if entire uniformed groups of men with maces is necessarily the most accurate thing in the world. Now let's try and find their commanding officer. Their commanding officer is the only man in the unit with a sword, and it looks much the same as the sword wielded by the commanding officer of the Bane of the Steppes. I can't say that blade looks specifically ahistoric either. So yeah, definitely like the unit. These guys will be making up the bulk of your attack force for now, both because they're really good units and also because there's nothing else you can really use as a substitute for them. Having looked at the Loca Rim Macemen, we'll now move on to the shock troops of the unit, starting off with the Valiant Warriors. And before we go into this actual unit itself, we should kind of address what a Variag is. In the book Return of the King, during the Battle of the Pelennor Field, it's mentioned that Mordor deploys a new type of soldier that the men of the West haven't seen before, Easterlings that are armed with large axes. And the depiction of these troops have changed depending on what media they've been in. I've actually sometimes seen these guys depicted more looking like dwarves than anything, which kind of fits their description in the books. But for the mod, the creators have given them a mix of a kind of Japanese appearance mixed with the Easterling standard design that you see in the films. And it's quite a stunning look, if I'm being honest. As you can see, they're all shock troops to begin with, so they don't really have shields, and they've got nice big weapons for carving through enemy ranks. These giant two-handed axes that they wield, which look remarkably similar to polearms than anything else, what with the backward spike and the spear tip on top. You run through enemy units with these, you'll hack them to pieces. The weapons are bronze, I'm pretty sure, though, because they've got this golden gleam to them, and I don't think you'd be using gold to make weapons out of, because, fun fact, gold does not make for good military equipment, be it blades or armor. It makes for nice decoration, but that's about it. The men of the unit are all covered in armor from head to toe. They've all got what I'm assuming are either bronze or gilded bronze breastplates. They've got plate armor covering their arms entirely. They don't properly have gauntlets, but it's not really a big deal. Underneath their armor, they've got the same red flowing robes. Over their legs, they have folds protecting their legs, so that looks good too. They've got, sorry for the units dipping in and out, I'm pretty sure they've got shin guards too, although I think they might be leather. And while leather historical armor is a bit on the not so much side, I'll give it a pass for the rest of the unit. And then you come to their helmets, and much like the other units in the faction so far, you can't see their faces, which is actually something that has been done historically as a way of intimidating your enemies. Because if all you see are ranks of men approaching you, you can't see their faces, you can't see the human behind the armor, it actually becomes really demoralizing. So the Easterlings definitely practice psychological warfare in battle, which is quite interesting to see. That, and also cuts down on the units that you have to use for their faces too. But I'll stick with the psychological warfare strategy of mine. Their helmets look very much like the samurai kabuto helmets that you see, what with the flaps around the side and the main metal core of the helmet. They definitely look quite intimidating with this armor. They've got what looks like, they've got, I think, what's horsehair sticking out of the back of their armor, and their helmet is banded with steel. They've got back plates too. The guys look amazing, and they've also got flags on their back, which bear the symbol of Sauron and the Snake of the East. And they've also got the sun too, which I'm guessing is an allusion to the fact that they live in a very much arid, plain-like area, so you're not going to be seeing much except the sun in the sky. That's my guess. The Variag commanding officer, he wears the same armor as the rest of his troops, however he is armed with their same type of long curved blade that I was talking about before, perfect for slashing, and he has an absolutely gorgeous shield. It's red and bronze or gold or whatever the hell it is, with a sun symbol on it. It looks amazing. Oh, and his flag on his back is the flag of Mordor, in black. He's got 2 flags, so he stands out to the rest of his unit with that as well. He too looks just as much of a badass as the rest of his unit with his armor, his shield and sword, and those 2 flags. Definitely a cool looking design. And yeah, shields in history often had designs and motifs, sometimes relating to where the warrior came from, so having a shield with the symbol of the sun on it makes sense for this guy. Overall, this unit looks amazing, and just yeah, I'm fanboying over it. Add these guys to your army, throw them at enemy lines at their weakest points, and they will definitely carve through them. However, these guys are not the only shock troops that the Easterlings have available to them, for they have one other that's a bit more elite. The Warlords of Rune. Eager for blood indeed, these guys look like it. Again, they've got the same terrifying no-face configuration going on with their armor. Their helmets look very similar to the other helmets I was mentioning before, except with one big difference. They've got nice big horns sticking out of it, and historically you would have helmets that did have attachments to them to a degree. You wouldn't have stuff necessarily like the Viking helmets, but for more ancient cultures you would sometimes have armor that included horns and other such attachments to the head. So it's 50-50 on the historical accuracy for this kind of helmet, which again is a composite of different types of helmets in real life. The mix of kind of a bit of a kettle helm for these guys, but also just the more stereotypical Japanese helmet that was worn by conscripted troops rather than the elite samurai. It reminds me of that, except done in metal, with horns and attached to it and the faceplate protecting it. So these guys are fairly well defended when it comes to their face. They've also got much darker armor compared to the rest of the faction, which helps them stand out a bit. It's kind of like the color of dried blood. They don't have shields either. They don't have gloves either, which a lot of the units actually don't have gloves. I've mentioned as we go on and on. They're covered in what I'm assuming is metal armor head to toe. It looks like their folds are made out of scale, I'd assume, or maybe brigandine. Their chest plate is covered in armor, similar to the rest with straps covering it. They've got metal bands ringing their arms, so their arms are well defended. And then you come to their weapon, and yeah, it is quite a weapon. A weapon fit for a general unit, which, by the way, the Warlords of Rune also double as a potential general unit if you don't want to use Bane of the Steppes instead. The weapon looks a lot like the Chinese polearm, which has a name that I'm totally forgetting. It's like a Guandao or something like that. It looks massive. It's like an oversized Naginata, the Japanese polearm. This weapon is made for hacking through stuff, probably through horses, if I'm being quite honest, which kind of makes sense given that the Easterlings do fight intertribal conflicts. They do use horses to some degree, so it makes sense that having a weapon that'll hack apart horses and men would be a go-to. Definitely a dangerous unit. These guys will punch a hole through enemy formations like nothing if used the right way, and yeah, they just look completely amazing too. And I think that's one way to sum up this faction. They look completely amazing. They've all got drip. And where is their commanding officer? Will he look any different? Will he have a bigger weapon than anyone else? I can't see him, if I'm being honest. I don't see anyone here with a weapon that looks any different from the other guys, or with armor that looks any different. So you'll just have to imagine someone in this unit is a commanding officer, and if so, it blends in with the rest of his guys. It's still quite a cool look that the unit has. Now that we've looked at the Warlords of Rune, we'll move on to the Spearmen of the faction. Also the only Spearmen of the faction, the Clan Guards. And as you can see, these guys wear very similar armor to the rest of the faction. However, theirs does look a bit different. For starters, they've still got the scale, or whatever the hell it is, covering their torso. They've got metal chest plate with a circular dome on it, which I believe is designed that when it's attacked, blade strikes will glance off of it, which was done historically too. They've got the red coverings underneath their armor. They've got the same shoulder pauldrons. They have shields though, which is very different. And the helmet is the same too. Except, no, some of their helmets look different. Some of them have little spikes sticking out of the top. which kind of reminds me of the crests that other helmets would have historically. So just keep in mind what I said for the rest of their armor for the other standard units of the faction. They've got a shield, and the shield is interesting. The shape is odd. Right, that's the thing. Or at least it would be, because normally if you have a shield that tapers, the taper is at the bottom of the shield, not the other way around. So these guys march with the spiky part of the shield pointing up. That's very interesting. Because if they just had a normal flat square shield with a big metal boss on top of it, I'd have said, yeah, that makes sense. They've got wood or wicker shields, added bronze on top to make it a bit more defensive. Perfectly makes sense. But then they've got the shields facing upwards with the spike, and that is fascinating. And the only thing I can kind of think of for why they'd have a spike like this is because they are a spearman unit. If they form up in a shield wall, they'll have gaps through which they can stab their spears and try and kill their enemies. Now, attacking them, their bodies are covered by shields. However, there's a gap where the spike part is, where the cutout is. However, in that cutout, what's behind it are the metal breastplates with the circles, meaning that any strike you make will probably glance off. Also, their arms have the heavy pauldrons made of metal, in what, I don't know exactly the hell you classify that as, but they've got heavy metal protecting their shoulders too, which means even if you can get through the gap to attack the other guy, all you're going to be doing is just stabbing his shoulders, which are well armored and can withstand a hit. So in a way, there is kind of logic behind this design. And that's always nice to see, interesting designs that have logic. That's their shield out of the way. Their spears kind of look like harpoons, if anything, what with the arrow tips. And then they've got spikes sticking out of it. And yeah, sometimes spears would have spikes sticking out of them, specifically to prevent stuff that is being stabbed from extending too far down the spear shaft and then getting caught on the spear, rendering the weapon useless and kind of making the soldier bearing the spear a liability, because he can't use his weapon to defend himself or to attack for a moment. And a moment is all you need in a battle to die. Now, this design, though, it's interesting because it's kind of redundant, isn't it? That spear is so damn wide that once you get stabbed through it, it's just going to keep going through you. And even once you reach these little spikes sticking out of the side, the spear tip is so large that it actually outsizes these, which means that you've already got a hole in you the size of the spearhead. These are smaller than the spearhead, they won't stop anything. They'll cut you, but they won't actually stop you from going up the shaft. I think it's designed to look cool, which it does, and to kind of give the Easterlings their own taste, which it does, but in regards to its efficiency, I'm not so sure. And here is their commanding officer, and he is a Warlord of Rune. And I'm not going to go over him because I just went over the Warlords of Rune, because it'll be the exact same thing. Definitely looks like a badass. So, as I said before, these are the only spearmen the faction have. But they are very good spearmen. Taking archers against these guys is kind of a useless thing. You'll be wasting your arrows, because with this armor and with those shields, they can withstand a hell of a lot of fire. There's far better targets to loose your bows at. Let's move on to the halberds of the faction, the Loca Rim Halberdias. And, well, they look exactly the same as the other guys, as the macemen I should say, except they don't have shields, and that's interesting. Their unit doesn't have shields in the mod. In the Lord of the Rings film, you actually see halberdiers who use shields, which I think Matt Easton, or Scholar of Gladiatoria, mentioned as something that was historically inaccurate, and then it turned out that there's depictions of halberdiers with shields, so it's kind of up in the air. But anyway, getting back to it, in the films they have shields, and they've also got two types of halberds. They've got shorter ones, which are like cut down pikes, kind of more like, and then you've got full-on extended halberds. Now, the armor, exactly the same, and their commanding officer is just a Loca Rim maceman, except he has a sword, and it's quite an interesting sword actually. It's not particularly long, it reminds me more of an arming sword than anything else, or maybe a Viking era blade, a Migration era blade, which kind of makes sense if these guys are meant to draw some inspiration from the Huns to give them a weapon that was around during the time of the Huns. Especially with the handle guard on that. It really does remind me of a Viking blade or a Saxon blade or whatever. Let's look at the actual thing that makes the halberdier unit a halberdier unit. The halberds. They're big, which is historically accurate. Halberds were quite large polearm weapons compared to more personal weapons that were wielded by more elite units on the battlefield, such as knights and their polearms, which are quite a bit smaller. They've got a large blade, which quite a bit. They've got nice big spear tips, which means that against cavalry they'll do quite well. And they've got large back spikes designed to drag down enemies, be they infantry or horsemen, drag them to the ground, knock them over, and get to hacking with the big blade. It's a halberd. I don't know if there's halberds with specifically this lag. Bad lag. But allow me to rephrase. I don't think that there's halberds in real life that had this sword-tipped kind of shape. This is something that seems a lot more modern when it comes to knives, or like the saw-toothed swords used by pioneer units in Napoleonic times. But regardless, it looks fantastic and fits the entire aesthetic of the unit. These guys, definitely a useful part of your battle line. They will mess up enemy units, specifically if they're fighting against lower class units. These guys are amazing. The one weakness though is archers, which goes without saying because they don't have shields. And while they do have armor that looks really damn good and probably is quite effective, against archers it's not so much. So that's one thing to be wary of when fielding these units. Archers and bowmen and the like. And with this unit now spoken of, there's no more line infantry for the faction, and that kind of goes to tell you just how unfinished the faction is right now. We'll move on to the first of their archer units, the Loca Rim Archers, who look exactly the same as the other Loca Rim Warriors, except they too do not bear shield, and instead they've got bows. Nice, massive recurve bows, which makes sense because recurve bows are the weapon that is most stereotypically associated with the steppe. So, yeah, I can't give fault for that. It's a weapon that makes sense for these guys. Got a quiver on their back. Their bows are spiky at the tips, or at least they've been covered in bronze at the tips. I don't know if that's really a historical thing. I know you could have horn-tipped bows, but I don't know about metal-tipped bows, but I'm not an archer. If there's someone out there who'd like to inform me on that, please feel free to do so. I love learning, even if I do look like a dumbass sometimes. Their commanding officer is just another Loca Rim warrior. Same thing I said before about the sword, the armor and everything, nothing new there. These guys make fairly good archers. They are heavily armored, but even so, they can suffer in archer exchanges. When it comes to melee combat, if they run out of arrows, they can do somewhat alright in battle if you use them for flanking attacks or they're fighting against really low-ranking enemies, like militia units, but against standard line infantry, these guys will definitely suffer in battle. So if you are going to use them as offensive infantry, make sure to use them much like shock troops, except not anywhere near as effective. Yeah, just keep that in mind when deploying these guys. So these are their Loca Rim Archers. They look cool, much like the rest of their brethren, but that's about it. And we'll move on to the next bowman unit that the faction can field, the Variag Bowmen. And these guys are definitely a step above the Loca Rim Bowmen, and that's pretty damn simple to see why. They're fully covered in plate armor, head to toe, with the samurai helmet on top, or samurai derivative helmet on top. They look amazing. And more importantly, their armor works amazingly too. So unlike the Loca Rim Archers, once these guys blow away the enemy formations with arrows, they can then switch to their swords or whatever melee weapon they wield and get stuck in the middle of things, and they will do well against enemy infantry. They're quite a bit of a match for them. So these units are quite elite when it comes to that, being able to fulfill both roles quite well. I don't think they're quite as good as the Loca Rim Macemen in battle. Or they may well be, I'm not too sure. But I think because they are archers, they might be slightly more underperforming than the line infantry, but I may be mistaken with that. They've also all got shields on their back. Yeah, so just even more protection against in battle and against enemy counterfire. They can block enemy fire with those big ass shields. Which, while when you're this well armored, shields they don't really need to be there because your armor is fulfilling the role that the shield would otherwise be taking. It doesn't matter. More armor is better armor as far as I'm concerned. The more protection, the better. Looking at their commanding officer, yep, he's got a nice big sword, nice big shield, and nice big black flags on his back, which these guys do not have, by the way. They've traded out their flags for the aforementioned shields. So as of now, these two are the only archer units that the faction has available to them. But by God, they're good archer units. I'd rather these than having crappy orc or just human militia archers. God, I love that colour. It's the red and the gold or the bronze or whatever. It looks amazing. And while the faction may have a small roster, it does also have some cavalry available to it. And these are the Variag Lancers. And these guys, again, look amazing. They've got the big red flags on their back. They've got the same armor as before. They've all got shields, which are on the smaller side of things, but shield's a shield. Their horses are unarmored, which don't make them quite as heavy cavalry as other units do, nor do they make them as protected in melee, because their horses are more susceptible to weaponry on the basis that they don't have any metal protecting them. Now, the weapon that each of these men carries are these giant spears that look like shoeing spears, and they look bronze as well. They're damn big, and they're really chunky spears. They've got the spikes sticking out of the side, which in this case is like a boar spear, and in this case would actually work because it's wider than the spears. If you stab something hard enough, you can pull out the spear because the spikes on the side prevent the person or creature being stabbed from being stuck to the spear. And when you're on horseback, you want to be able to keep using your spear to spear down anything in your path. The horses do have some protection over here though, just over the top of their heads, which, it's good for them. You don't want to see horses dying after all, unless you're a psychopath. Heavy cavalry unit fulfills the role well that this faction needs, and they look bloody elite. What else can you say? It's a cool unit. And their commanding officer is also quite a cool looking dude with his nice big blade, 2 flags on his back and the shield. Again, it's a cool looking unit. I cannot stop reiterating that, because it is the truth, for both the unit and the faction as a whole. And now we'll turn to the last unit that the faction can field. Wow, that was a painful bit of lag. Absolutely atrocious. The onagers. And as you can probably tell, these are artillery pieces. And with these, the Easterlings have the ability to attack enemy fortifications, be they town walls, castles, gatehouses, towers, anything really. However, while these do fulfill that role, they're not the best in the world. There are better forms of artillery available in the mod, and those are specifically used by the factions that oppose the Easterlings more than anything, being the Gondorians. Their trebuchets outrange these and are probably more accurate than these, but at a pinch the onagers will serve a purpose. Their crew members are all heavily armoured Loca Rim Warriors, or armed with swords, which is nice to see. It makes them a bit different from the others, both in their faction and for other onager crew, because most onager crew are normally really lightly armed warriors. These guys are fairly well equipped, so it's nice to see that. Can't say much more about them. They'll do a job, but there's others who can do their job that much better. Or that bit better, I should say. And with us having looked at the onagers, I do believe that's all of these units in the faction that have been covered. So now let's talk about the faction as a whole. It's unfinished. I think it's pretty clear to see that. The faction is unfinished. But, that doesn't mean, though, that the faction is bad. If anything, it's quite a compact faction that packs quite a bit of power. What with the shock troops, the archers, and the cavalry, it can sure as hell hold its line against any enemy foe right now. And once its unit roster is broadened by upcoming updates whenever they come in the future, the faction will look that much nicer. I'm a big fan of them, as you can probably tell from all the fanboying in the video. I hope they get more units. My god, I hope they get more units. But up until then, I will be more than happy to use the faction as they currently stand. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed the video. This is your host, Jakov, signing out.